Prescient Investment Management is a systematic asset manager. We're around since more than 26 years, and I guess we pride ourselves by being driven by numbers and not by narratives. Our industry is full of expert stories, and while some of them might be interesting, they don't really necessarily give you what's needed to achieve good financial outcomes. So just cutting out the noise, cutting through the headlines, that's what really gives us an edge. You have to be quite data-driven to achieve that, so we process almost 1 billion data points every day now, so that really gives us an edge. But the trick is obviously to not just have all of this data, but also turn that data into information, and eventually information into knowledge. And for that you need a quite big team, I think a dedicated team which is skilled in this space. And we have that with more than 35 people in the investment team, all of them quite young and quite tech-savvy. We achieve that, and we create very good outcomes over the long term for our clients. It's great to showcase these tools. We always love to bring our clients along on the journey, and we pride ourselves with the transparency of our approach. So one of the tools which I would like to showcase today is our Prescient Economic Indicator. Prescient Economic Indicator is our own proprietary nowcasting tool. What that means is it tells us in real time where the US economy is at. And it's an important tool for us because the US economy, as we think, is driving the global economy, and staying attuned with what's happening in the world out there is just absolutely crucial for our financial markets. So why don't we just look at GDP prints, because they're readily available? Well, the reality is that GDP prints are heavily outdated. They get released way too late. They're biased by seasonal adjustments. They might be biased by trade politics right now. So we don't really like them. We like to rather capture the broad trend of the US economy, and we use that through our own tool, the Prescient Economic Indicator. So our Prescient Economic Indicator is designed in a way that we try to put together as much macroeconomic data as possible. So what you can see on this chart, for example, is quite a few subsets of the US economy. We start with net exports of goods and services, gross domestic income, business confidence, financial conditions, gross private domestic estimates, etc., investments, etc. And we use all of these to estimate where the US economy is going. You can see that these are not components of a traditional macroeconomic equation which tells you where GDP is, but these are more all tools which are way faster moving and very good in terms of approximating where the economy could be. Obviously, below these buckets, there's way more data. So if I look into our labor market conditions, you can see that there's a lot of data prints. Most of these get updated every first Friday of the month when the Bureau of Economic Research in the States releases the payroll prints, but then obviously on other data points you get them at a different point. I can do the same analysis for economic conditions, or I can even move this further into consumer sentiment, but you can see already now it's a lot of data and hard to understand. So trying to make sense of all of this, that's what we're trying to achieve. And then obviously we must see if all of this works. So what you can see here on the x-axis is our nowcasting, so our estimate of the US economy, the estimate of the Prescient Economic Indicator. And then on the y-axis you can see the real GDP prints as they were released. You can see there's a strong correlation between the two, and this regression line cuts straight to that. And all those blue dots are lined up quite nicely around it. Statistically speaking, we have a 74% degree of accuracy in terms of explaining where the US economy is in real time, and we do think that's quite powerful. We can show through time how the two time series have behaved. So if I zoom in a little bit, you can see that the Prescient Economic Indicator in the dark blue line was quite close to the real GDP prints in the turquoise line. The beauty of this whole approach is that if I zoom in ever further, I really can put together a quite objective and factual story around what we have observed in the US economy. Again, the estimate in the dark blue and the real GDP prints in turquoise, and our current guesstimate, not guesstimate, more estimate, which is roughly just above 1% on the very right hand side. So we estimate in real time that the US economy is growing just above 1%. You can see that there's movement around those two lines, so the prediction is not always perfect. You can see the last GDP print at this point came out as 3%, while we were just estimating 1%. But we think that's almost a good thing, because the 3% of the actual GDP print were just a fact of distortion by adjusted trade dynamics. It's quite a lot of charts and a lot of data, as you can see, but for us it's really important to understand into the last detail where the US economy is headed. So we can obviously then take this way further and basically attribute exactly what are the drivers, like which of those buckets which I've just shown you are driving US GDP and which of the buckets are detracting. And then even the sub-bucket, so if we look into the US labor market, we won't just see how the US labor market is doing itself, we won't just see the unemployment rate, we even understand where there are productivity gains, whether, for example, bachelors leaving college are finding jobs, or whether unemployment is stronger amongst maybe more senior workers, so to say. So basically understanding everything to detail, that's what we do. I mentioned the word timeliness quite often, so that's really crucial for us to understand that it's like really in real time what we're tracking, and with that we have done more work to also understand the Federal Reserve quite well. These days we all follow the Federal Reserve quite closely, and monetary policy is so decisive in terms of where interest rates go, and with that where capital markets go. And for us to understand that, the better we understand it, the more accurate we can basically asset allocate between asset classes and understand what monetary policy, how it impacts certain asset class behaviors. We all listen to the words of Jerome Powell, and we don't always read his speeches in entirety, but basically every speech which Jerome Powell, every speech which he holds is backed by a physical PDF document which is actually published on the website of the Federal Reserve. So one of the tools which we have developed is our natural language processing algorithm, which helps us to pull all the speeches of the Federal Reserve which are released in that very moment and analyze them for us. So basically, whether it's a speech from Jerome Powell today, or whether it's a speech of one of the governors of the regional Feds, or whether it's a speech which happened in the past, we can tell you exactly and objectively whether that speech was dovish, whether the speech was hawkish. We can also understand what the topic of the speech were. Was the Federal Reserve mostly focused on interest rates, on global growth, were they worried about financial stability, or maybe what other central banks were doing. The Fed also addresses different audiences. Sometimes they talk a lot about companies, sometimes they speak about the consumer, sometimes again they speak about what governments should be doing or are doing, and we capture all of that systematically through that process and turn those words into numbers. So what we're showing on this chart is basically exactly what I just described. So the red line is just the effective Fed fund rate, so where the Fed set interest rates through time, and then the blue line is our estimate whether the speech was dovish or hawkish. So you can see whenever the blue line is at the bottom, as in the area where I'm hovering, interest rates stayed very low because the estimate was dovish. If you look into an area where interest rates were shooting up, like the last hiking cycle, you can see at the top, our blue line is at the top, meaning that we interpreted the words of the Federal Reserve and the regional Feds as very hawkish, and that's exactly when rates went up. So we have a lot of predictive power in these tools, and it's quite powerful to understand that this naturally gives us an edge. Those boxes which are hovering and moving quickly, if I just stay on one for a second, you can see exactly a reasoning why the speech was classified in this instance as neutral, and also the context of the speech. So it's quite powerful to have all of this analysis done for us by the engine, and the reality is that if we would do it as human beings, the interpretation wouldn't be as accurate, it would be driven by human biases, and it would be just different whether I do it today when I'm in a good mood or tomorrow when I'm in a bad mood. We can do way more around this, and I'm just going to illustrate some more context. Here's just a classification algorithm where we're using data, for example, out of the 70s to understand the speech of Paul Volcker. I'm going to skip that one and these ones for now. And I just want to take you one step further to an interpretation of, let's call it the financial sector. So basically we want to measure how often does the Federal Reserve mention in a negative way the financial sector. And what you can see is this period here, starting 2006, 2007, the way into 2008, the negative mentions around the financial sector just do pick up quite dramatically, and that's exactly when the financial crisis started. Just want to illustrate the predictive power of these tools. You can do the same thing on the opposite side. So on the upside, as soon as we hit the later part of 2008 and the early start of 2009, that's when there were, despite us still being in the global financial crisis, more and more positive mentions around the financial sector, and that's when equity markets started to strongly rebound. We can also look during the COVID crisis. You can see there's little positive or negative mentions around the financial sector, simply because the financial sector never was under pressure. It was a completely different crisis. We can switch the financial sectors off, and we can look into maybe mentions of other central banks, how often are positively or negatively other central banks the center of a Fed speech. And you can see that this picks up, for example, quite dramatically during the taper tantrum. That's basically when the Fed was ending QE, but the ECB decided to still keep negative interest rates, and that after a while led to a quite strong underperformance of European equities against US equities. And one could have picked up this period quite nicely by just looking at the natural language analysis which we are suggesting in this indicator. That one core edge of this whole approach, and I think that's really important to understand, is that this is data which is available to us but nobody else. So we want to make clear that this is obviously where we see the future of investing going. The power of this tool is really that it's for us now possible to turn any word into a number, and obviously we will take this way further than just looking at the Fed speeches. We already started to do the same analysis for the South African Reserve Bank, and it doesn't have to stop there. We can basically analyze any speech and find meaning in it. We hope we could illustrate some tools today and give you a little bit of an insight on how the future of investing really looks. We do use a lot of data. We process that information in a smart way so that we can turn data into information and information into knowledge. And that's how we set ourselves apart from our peers. Why are we doing everything this way around? It's just simply because we are convinced that in the long term, this is the best way to create the best outcomes for our clients.